Our credit ratings agency Moody's has warned of a number of financial challenges facing South Africa ahead of Finance Minister Tito Mboweni's speech. COVID-19 affected government's tax revenue collection and raised the cost of borrowing and pushed the economy into its longest recession in almost 3 decades. To speak to us about this is development economist from Stellenbosch Business School, Dr Nthabiseng Moleko. Dr. Moleko, good evening and thank you so much for your time. There seems to be a sense that South Africa might be in for yet another ratings downgrade. I mean, how probable is that right now?
Well, Kathy, if you look at the scenario and the situation we're in, given the unlikely strengthening of the financial balance sheet of the state, the fiscus, but also just the lackluster economic growth that we have experienced historically, but going forward projected, have we done adequately enough to actually propel economic growth and boost economic activity? And I think if you look at the performance of our economic indicators, it's pointing to the inadequate short-term interventions, which should have bolstered and dealt with the economic shock of COVID. But the long-term cyclical measures that are needed to restructure the economy are really needed to boost long-term growth projections, but also the forecast of I'd call it the economic growth investment pathways that have to be transformed so we can change the economic outcomes. So the likelihood of continued negative outlook from rating agencies is probably the most probable thing if we don't change the economic outcomes, if we don't change the path that we are on, which can be changed, by the way.
Of course, when we look at South Africa pre-COVID-19, it was quite reasonable for ratings agencies to make some of the decisions that they did, especially because there was a lot of stagnation in terms of the reforms that were promised and whether or not government was actually aligning policy with those promised reforms. We've been in the middle of a pandemic for literally the past year now. There's the Queensberry rule, I believe. Doesn't that apply in a scenario such as this?
So I just want to go back a little bit in terms of, let's look at why ratings agencies were there. Ratings agencies are not really there to measure our economic performance and efficacy in terms of policy. Ratings agencies were actually established very far back in the 1930s, 60s to rate the quality of bonds or issuance by government and corporates. So the fact that they are able to issue either AAA, BBB sub-investment on your issuance is a different issue to looking at the performance of an economic strategy and an economic plan of a country. So I want to differentiate the two. I think South Africa's highly financialized capital markets and also economy has taken us along a path where we are so concerned about what rating agencies say. Ratings agencies matter if you borrow debt. If you borrow and your expenditure and your growth path is reliant on the rollout of debt. So ratings agencies then give your likely borrowers the risk premium of a country. However, if your growth trajectory is using alternative resources, capital mobilization to bolster your economy, to grow your economic growth path and to turn around your economy, you don't have to be obsessed about what's happening with rating agencies. In fact, we've seen some emerging markets saying, listen, it's great that your rating agencies have a view. We're even going to create our own rating agencies. But even further, they focus on their national development plan, their own economic growth path, their development trajectory of reducing unemployment, boosting economic activity, increasing SMME enterprise development, and all the other economic indices that improve poverty, that improve inclusion, that set your manufacturing value add as a component to GDP on a higher trajectory. So these are the things that should be important for policymakers and not the highly financialized regulators, which are important if you're borrowing. But there's also alternative to raising capital in the markets, which we need to look at, particularly in a time of crisis.
But of course, when we look at our debt to GDP ratio, and I'm going to ask the team to put that graph up on the screen just once more, because when we look at the last 10 years, South Africa has been increasing its acquisition of debt. So doesn't it become more important what the ratings agencies have to say simply because we are so reliant on borrowing?
So South Africa actually, Kathy, has been problemizing its lackluster growth by focusing debt to GDP as a ratio. So the important point that you raise is that the ratio has been deteriorating, primarily because the contracting output. So we've been stuck in the last decade, 2 decades, in what we call a low growth trap. So the economic output, which is the basis or the denominator when you look at debt to GDP, is the basis for a contracting or rather worsening debt to GDP scenario. So if you improve your output, if you improve economic activity, if your fiscal stabilizes, your fiscal multiplies, if your growth path is not dependent on debt, if your growth path is not a consumptive but rather productive investment type of a growth path, you're going to begin to see output increasing. More people have disposable income, more SMMEs employing people, more economic activity on both the supply side and the demand side of the economy. So when you turn around the actual downward trajectory of South Africa's economy, you'll begin to see economic output increasing. Krugman, who's a World Bank renowned economist, talks to the debt to GDP ratio of 90% being the mark at which we begin to see a recessive outcome of debt to GDP, i.e., even if you borrow more, the cost to borrowing, the servicing of that debt begins to have a negative effect, even despite the positive growth multiply effects that would come from the fiscal multiply. So it's important for us to acknowledge that there is a point at which debt to GDP becomes not necessarily positive in terms of the gains. But South Africa has not reached that point yet, but also South Africa has had lackluster growth. And I think that's really the important point to also emphasize. Unless we grow, debt to GDP will worsen. Even if, Kathy, we reduce our expenditure and we continue with austerity, which is not good in a time of economic downturn and recession. It shows harmful both short-term and long-term effects, which are disastrous, particularly between economic or exogenous shocks like COVID, which we're experiencing now. So you've got to look at economic stabilizers that improve and resuscitate your supply side and your household aggregate demand so that you can get out of the negative effect of a shock, but then look at the long-term trajectory as to how you can improve the long-run economic growth path.
So in terms of these considerations and what some have described as this warning from Moody's effectively earlier on in the month, how much of that do you think needs to and could well weigh on Finance Minister Tito Mboweni as he gets ready to make his budget statement on Wednesday?
Yeah, that's looking at the history of National Treasury and how the Treasury has been geared towards a specific a type of outcome. We've accepted that. I think National Treasury has looked at the austerity as the way forward, has also long-term looked at a budget surplus as the way forward. But I think the more important thing is to assess whether these stabilizers and the response of Treasury has been efficient, has dealt with the national contraction and output indices. Even if they implement these measures in the short run, have they necessarily averted the effects of the negative effects of the economic crisis? And I think we have seen the results is that the leaders in South Africa, particularly the economic cluster, must urgently look at interventions that promote both inclusive growth path, but an alternative economic recovery plan. I think the second point, I think the Minister of Finance, I would appeal that we look at counter-cyclical measures, one, two, resuscitate coordination between both the monetary policies, the Reserve Bank and National Treasury to implement reforms, particularly that enable a coordinated fashion of both the trade, the industrialization outcomes that we want to see, so that we don't have kind of a conflict in terms of economic policy where we're trying to grow in terms of subsectors that will kickstart our economy, but we're actually seeing some of the elements not necessarily aiding in resuscitation. So things like cheaper finance, more aggressive interest rates. We're seeing some economies even resuscitating to the point where the Reserve Bank lends to the government interest-free. This is a form of moving the pressure away from borrowing from your capital markets, but actually using your monetary policy instruments as a critical growth effect or growth starter so that you can simply resuscitate in the short run, Kathy. This is not a thing that you do for long-term purposes, but rather in the short run to boost and resuscitate. But then you look at the long-term structural path that you can reform so that you boost then the economy's recovery indeed for the long haul. And remember, South Africa's economic crisis stems from pre-COVID. And I think The problem that we have is if we want to return to pre-crisis levels, we will remain in a crisis. So it's important for us to agree that we have to not go back to what was pre-crisis, because it was a crisis. And so we need to look at alternatives that will really take us to a new alternative growth path, where South Africans are all working, where South African businesses are resuscitated, where business confidence is improved, where we see FDI being crowded in and public investment being really the driver, the key enabler to driving that. And I think the important thing, local government, we cannot miss out that the fiscal multiplier in local economies is critical. And I think we're missing an opportunity to use local government, local economies, and the multiplier within this to actually boost and resuscitate economic growth.
Dr. Moleko, it's interesting that you've brought up the issue of the recovery plan in South Africa needing a different economic recovery plan. It's something that has been echoed by different institutions over the last month or so, after really having had an opportunity to dissect the president's proposed economic reconstruction and recovery plan. It doesn't look like that's changing the president's mind at all, because we heard him speak about it at the State of the Nation address, and all expectations are that the finance minister will continue within the same line, really. What does that do for the country, to have a plan that doesn't seem to enjoy the support of experts in the sector? And quite frankly, just looking at some of the analysts we've spoken to, we've had the Thabo Mbeki Foundation on, the Human Sciences Research Council, just to name a few, and all of them are saying the same thing, that this is not the kind of plan that is going to get South Africa anywhere. It's more worrying with time.
We have to continue to lobby, advocate, and pray for the economy of South Africa. I want to appeal. South Africans cannot give up. The reason why it's critical for South Africa to employ an alternative growth path is that South Africa has a lot of multiply effects and determines the outcome and the situation for the rest of the continent. A lot of the outcomes that we see in South Africa will have a ripple effect to the Southern African Customs Union and also to the greater parts of the continent. We have got to see in emphasis, just as we have seen with the National Command Council for the pandemic, we have got to see the same kind of coordination, efficacy, and monitoring of outcomes with the economic cluster. And I think I'm making an appeal that South Africans don't give up. South Africans, when they were in crises in the early 90s, they joined forces, they worked together. There was a propelling and a efficacy and an effort by civil society, academics, South Africans themselves, households, businesses, to say we need to have an alternative, because if we continue along this path, we are going to perish as a people. So I want to encourage South Africans, pray for the country, pray for the economic cluster, but also enforce change in terms of the economic stabilizers, but also the long-term growth path of the economic strategy, so that we can see a change, so that South Africans can all be part of the economy, and not just we go back to what was pre-2019, 2020, but we actually see something completely new that's never been done and seen before in South Africa. And all our provinces, our rural areas, our households, our businesses are actually revived, restored, and every South African is productively participating. Our youth are participating, that they have a hopeful future and they contribute to the economic output of South Africa. And I think we need to seriously put an emphasis on working together, coordinating ourselves, so that we can transform South Africa's economic fortunes.